This is BBC World News Today. I'm Nancy Katchingira. These are our top stories. Rescue efforts ramp up in the Bahamas. The government warns the final death toll from Hurricane Dorian will be staggering as the clear-up operation begins.
I think Abaco will not recover until the next 10 years. Like fully recover, because everything is gone. Absolutely everything is gone.
Zimbabwe's president pays tribute to Robert Mugabe, calling the late leader a national hero, but fails to mention the suffering endured under his rule.
Comrade Mugabe bequeaths a rich and indelible legacy of tenacious adherence to principle on the collective rights of Africa and Africans.
A turbulent week for Britain's Prime Minister ends with opposition parties uniting to block a snap general election in October. And coming up, we're live with the latest on an emergency meeting to save the Amazon rainforest. But one world leader is noticeably absent. Hello and welcome to World News Today. Officials in the Bahamas say the number of deaths caused by Hurricane Dorian could be staggering. At the moment, 30 people are known to have been killed, but many areas remain cut off. Now, in the last hours, Dorian has made landfall over Cape Hatteras in North Carolina and has weakened to a Category 1 storm. But the full force of the hurricane was felt in the Abaco Islands in the Bahamas. These are the latest pictures from there. Along with aid and equipment, officials are now sending morticians and 200 body bags. Richard Galpin has this report.
It's hard to imagine how anyone can survive now here in the ruins of Marsh Harbour, one of the largest cities in the Abaco Islands. Dorian, a Category 5 hurricane, hit this island at full force and stayed over it for 2 days. Hundreds or possibly thousands of people are missing here and on other neighbouring islands.
I honestly believe Abaco is finished. I think Abaco will not recover until the next 10 years. Like fully recover, because everything is gone. Absolutely everything is gone.
And that includes food. Inevitably, some people have been breaking into shops to find something to eat and drink.
What are you doing?
As supplies become increasingly scarce. But help is at hand from this British naval vessel, which has been in the area on hurricane watch for some time. It's been delivering essential supplies, including hygiene kits and clean drinking water, to those most in need on this island. Other international and local organisations have also been bringing in small amounts of food. And the United Nations is now promising to fly in 85 tonnes of ready-to-eat meals. But when this will arrive is unclear.
In any disaster response, aid doesn't get to the affected areas as quickly as you want. But in this case, it's particularly challenging because so much of the infrastructure has been completely destroyed. We're hearing that the airspace is dangerously overcrowded. So we're prioritizing those things which are most needed.
But for many of the survivors here, conditions are so bad that they're trying to get away from this island as quickly as possible. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
The former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, has died at the age of 95. Mr. Mugabe dominated his country for decades. He led the independence struggle against white minority rule and then himself ruled Zimbabwe for 37 years. His early achievements in broadening access to health and education for the black majority were later marred by violence and economic collapse. He was ousted in a military coup in 2017. Our correspondent Shingai Nyoka is in the capital, Harare, for us this evening.
He was once Zimbabwe's liberator, leading a war against white minority rule. But by the end, the adulation President Robert Mugabe once enjoyed was gone.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe,
He cemented his power, winning overwhelmingly at elections in 1980. As leader of a new nation, he set about creating a better country.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe.
He cemented his power, winning overwhelmingly at elections in 1980. As leader of a new nation, he set about creating a better country than the one he inherited.
There can never be any return to the state of armed conflict which existed before our commitment to peace and the democratic process of election under the Lancaster House Agreement. Surely, this is now time to beat our swords into plowshares.
He spent massively on education and infrastructural development, building a thriving black middle class and one of the most literate populations on the continent. But there was a vicious, ruthless side to the statesman. Between 1983 and 1987, Mugabe deployed a military unit trained by the North Koreans to deal with his political opponents in the south of the country. Thousands were murdered, and the world seemed happy to turn a blind eye. But as the 1990s ended, the economy was in trouble. Facing new political opposition, Mugabe made a fateful step. He gave the go-ahead for the seizure of white-owned farms. He knew this was fertile ground. This was the land that the country's wealth was built on. White farmers fled. The Western world took note, breaking diplomatic ties and imposing economic sanctions. The opposition, its leaders, human rights workers, bore the brunt of his anger. In 2008, in the midst of 1 billion% inflation and widespread unemployment, Mr. Mugabe suffered his first electoral defeat. It only led to more violence in the second round of voting. Britain stripped him of his knighthood. Former allies condemned him.
Nearer to home, we had seen the outbreak of violence against in our neighboring Zimbabwe.
Tonight, President Emerson Mnangagwa paid this tribute.
A veteran nationalist and a dogged Pan-Africanist fighter, Comrade Mugabe bequeaths a rich and indelible legacy of tenacious adherence to principle on the collective rights of Africa and Africans in general, and in particular, the rights of the people of Zimbabwe.
In Harare, many people chose to remember the liberator.
He was my first president. So to me, he deserves a great honor.
This is sad news. We lost a good father. Mugabe was all right.
But the truth of his last years in power was that his country was collapsing around him. He could no longer hide his frailty and leant increasingly on his younger wife, Grace. She had ambitions of her own. But the rising discontent coup, Mugabe was ousted and the country celebrated. There are reminders of Robert Mugabe everywhere, but here on the streets there are no visible signs of mourning. That's because he lived out his last years cut off from public and political life in an opulent mansion far removed from the struggles of many Zimbabweans. Many will remember him as a gifted orator and visionary who liberated Zimbabwe, but who turned his back on the high ideals he'd originally believed in.
Shinganyoka there. Let's get a bit more on that now with Milton Nkosi, who's been getting the reaction in Johannesburg in South Africa. Hello, Milton. Where you are in South Africa, Robert Mugabe was always remembered as someone who stood against apartheid. But now that he's gone, how have people reacted to the news of his death?
There's been a mixed reaction, Nancy, to Robert Mugabe's passing here in South Africa. Remember, there is an estimated 2 to 4 million people from Zimbabwe who've run away from the economic decline of that country seeking new opportunities here in South Africa. And today I spoke to some Zimbabweans. I asked them how they felt about it, and one of them just say, I don't feel anything. I am here because of him. I'm not at home. So there are many people who are remembering a tyrant, a dictator, a man who caused a lot of misery for many people. But some are remembering a liberator, a freedom fighter, a man who went to prison for 10 years by the white minority rule government in Rhodesia then, and who was even refused the permission to bury his own son at the time, and a man who set up an amazing education system in Zimbabwe from which many Zimbabweans, millions of them, are still benefiting today. So a mixed reaction at the news of Robert Mugabe's passing, Nancy.
And you've hinted at this already, that Robert Mugabe has always divided opinion geographically and historically as well. But is there any consensus at all to be found on what his legacy will now be, not just in Zimbabwe, but in the rest of Africa?
Consensus on Robert Mugabe? I doubt it. I've been looking, listening, reading, and there is such divided opinion on what Robert Mugabe stands for. The very news that a former president of Zimbabwe dies in a hospital in Singapore, that in itself tells you a story. He should have actually died in a hospital in Zimbabwe. That means that the health system was not good enough for him. And that is exactly what people are talking about, those who are remembering the dark days of Mr. Mugabe's rule. Remember that he also lifted the spirit of the Pan-Africanists here. I remember in 2002, Nancy, at a conference here in Johannesburg on World Sustainable Development, where Robert Mugabe told the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe. That gave a lot of confidence to Africans who wanted to be free beyond colonial rule.
Well, he did keep his Zimbabwean for quite a long time, but what state has he left Zimbabwe in now? Do people feel that things have gotten better?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, number one, he was ousted in a coup. Remember that we just heard from the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, paying tribute to Robert Mugabe. But Robert Mugabe 2 years ago was ousted in a military coup in Harare. So the state of the country is still not strong enough. They are battling to bring that economy up. And that is why in South Africa you still have millions of Zimbabweans who have come here so that they could work and earn money and send it back home because there aren't enough jobs there.
All right, Milton gossips in Brexit and attempts by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson to call an early election. So far, those attempts have failed, with opposition parties coming together and insisting one can't happen until after an EU summit in mid-October. The opposition parties are also close to successes in passing a law that would prevent a no-deal Brexit. Here's our deputy political editor John Pinar.
Here we go. Much easier this than leading the country. Boris Johnson's trying to call an election before Brexit to stick to his plan, leave on time, deal or no deal. Yeah. But he's lost control and he wants it back.
We must get Brexit done, and that's my message to my colleagues. Let's come together, get this thing over the line and unite our country, and then get on with defeating the Labour opposition, when they finally have the guts to have an election.
You can almost smell the election coming, but he's having to wait. A spectator as his opponents try to force him to give up on a no-deal Brexit, break his promise, maybe his premiership.
You keep mentioning October the 31st. You've made it abundantly clear that's your line in the sand. If you can't deliver that, you're going to have to resign, aren't you?
That is not a hypothesis I'm willing to contemplate. I want us to get this thing done.
Today in the Lords, the legislation banning no deal was sent to become law, decreeing there'd be no election till Brexit's delayed.
As many of that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, the contents have it.
Opponents had coordinated their plans.
We've agreed that we're not going to give the Prime Minister the general election he is so desperate for. until an extension is secured and the risk of no deal is completely eliminated.
The Prime Minister is on the run. Boris is broken. We have an opportunity to bring down Boris, to break Boris, and to bring down Brexit, and we must take that.
I want an election. Well, he has gone out with ridiculous promises of leaving the European Union on the 31st of October. Boris Johnson, that's not going to happen.
No sight of Jeremy Corbyn, though he gathered opposition leaders by phone. Labour's Brexit policy is still a work in progress. But the parties joined the alliance that's cornered Boris Johnson. And in Downing Street, they're searching for a plan, any plan, that'll somehow help the PM regain some kind of control.
He's sworn he'll never seek an extension to Brexit, but now a new law could force him to do just that. He won't break his word, he can't break the law. Mr. Johnson needs to find a way to force an election or salvage his plan to deliver Brexit, maybe without reaching an EU deal first. And in there's no sign they've found one.
We asking for an extension, Mr. Frost?
What chance of a last-minute deal? Britain's Brexit negotiator, David Frost, has been in Brussels today, but the Finnish PM, who's chairing the EU, suggested a no-deal exit could be close.
It seems very obvious that we are not getting Brexit with agreement.
110! 110!
On with the whites and off to Peterhead Market. Campaigning keeps you busy. Haggling's part of the job.
£50 per fish. Good God, that's expensive fish.
Boris Johnson's famously upbeat, but his premiership could still end badly.
Our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar reporting there. Let's take a look now at some of the other stories making the news. A House of Representatives committee is investigating US Vice President Mike Pence's visit to Ireland after he stayed at a Trump-owned hotel 300 kilometres from Dublin, where he was meeting officials. A spokesman for Mr. Pence said they stayed at the hotel at the suggestion of President Trump, something the president has denied. 8 US states and the District of Columbia have launched an antitrust investigation into Facebook. It's in a bid to determine if the social media giant has stifled competition and put users at risk. The investigation wants to determine if Facebook endangered consumer data, reduced the quality of consumers' choices, or increased the price of advertising. The Swedish lawyer who represented rap star A$AP Rocky has been shot and injured in Stockholm, police say. The extent of his injuries are not known, but he is understood to have been shot in the chest, head and abdomen. Swedish media have reported that the attack did not appear to be linked to his work, and authorities called the incident an isolated act. Now, images of the Amazon rainforest, the so-called lungs of the world, on fire, triggered international outrage. Now, several leaders from countries in the region are meeting in Colombia to talk about how to stop them, to protect the Amazon. Our correspondent Will Grant is joining me now. Hello, Will. This summit, in light of the extent of the damage we've seen, what can it actually achieve, and what do they hope to get done?
I mean, one wants to think, well, political will could do a lot. And certainly if all of the nations in the Amazon were pulling in the same direction, if they had international backing, sufficient funds, and there was a clear and coherent kind of plan, then you might say, well, they can actually create some concrete actions, they could be better prepared for next year's dry season, they could deal with the issues that are still going on. One fears, though, that this is going to end up being a little too late. particularly because obviously some key protagonists aren't actually there. As you mentioned, Jair Bolsonaro. Brazil has the largest Amazon territory of any of the nations who are due to be at this summit. And of course, some of the policies of various nations, not just Brazil, but particularly Brazil, about opening up the Amazon to mining, to agribusiness, to logging, to cattle grazing, are extremely detrimental. And having seen it for myself, just last week, flown over the region, it is an environmental crisis. It can't be denied, and there is a question just about how quickly it can be tackled by the various presidents sitting around the table in Colombia.
Now, you've mentioned seeing the extent of the damage. You've flown over these fires and seen just how vast the areas we're talking about are. But have you seen any interventions yet? Have you seen anything being done to tackle this problem?
We saw very limited intervention, very little intervention in the part of the region that we were in. There was nothing going on the ground itself where the fires that we flew over were. There was some kind of deployment of troops, firefighters, and that was supposed to be part of a coordinated effort involving the Environment Ministry in Brazil. The Foreign Minister has given an interview in Brazil where he says that the fires are now under control, but the environmentalists I spoke to said that in fact these are the very worst weeks. September and October are extremely dry, and if the fires haven't been gotten under control in certain areas, and it's such a vast space that we're talking about, it would be hard to think that they are fully under control, that they'll just continue to worsen and worsen and worsen. So, it's a very, very mixed picture across the region.
Mm-hmm. And with all that in view, what commitments might we possibly expect to see these leaders making at these discussions, and what commitments might they expect from the rest of the world, if any?
Well, they're talking about an itinerary. Now, one supposes that means about, planning for, obviously, future years, working out what they can do for the kind of current crisis. Mr. Bolsonaro particularly is keen for things to be done by the Amazon nations themselves. So, given that there was reticence to receive money from the G7, there was the whole argument about the 20 million euros that was offered there, I assume, and it's not clear yet until we get the final document, that there will have to be some kind of protocols put in place about how the nations can work together, because obviously the fire doesn't respect the national borders. And some way of pooling the resources between Bolivia, Brazil and Peru, for example, in order to make sure that the best can be done both in the future and for this current wildfire crisis.
All right, Will Grant, thank you very much for staying on that for us. Let's return to Brexit and the question of EU citizens currently living in the UK. Out of 3 million so far, less than half have applied for the right to live and work in the UK after Brexit. The UK government says 1.4 million have applied to the EU settlement scheme. There are concerns, though, that some people have had problems with the scheme and others remain worried about their future. Our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth, has been talking to some of those who are affected.
Lily Bourrier has lived and worked around Bristol for more than 15 years. Originally from France, she married an Englishman and has 2 children, both born in the UK. With Brexit on the horizon, she applied under a government scheme to make sure she could stay here after, but is still waiting to hear the outcome.
I love my life here. I've got my working life here and I love my job. And my children are growing up here. I believe they've got their future here. But I'm not sure about mine.
The Home Office says Lily's application wasn't fully submitted and they will help her resolve it. But even a technical glitch has had an impact.
A feeling of being rejected to the country you call home.
Around 3 million EU citizens live in the UK. All are being urged to apply to guarantee their rights after Brexit.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK,
the Home Office has been promoting the scheme. Anyone who's been here more than 5 years should get what's called settled status, meaning they can stay indefinitely. Those who've been here less than 5 years should get pre-settled status, which protects their rights, but means they'll have to apply again for full status. Charity in Leeds is helping people with the process. There are concerns that some people are getting the wrong status and others aren't applying at all.
There are a lot of people from vulnerable communities with low level of English or no English at all who does not know about this.
Ministers say more people are accessing the scheme and there's help for the most vulnerable.
It works really well. It's not dissimilar to if you and I are renewing our passport, our driving licence. It's a very clear, very simple system. People can apply and we get that system processed, and actually often in just a few days.
Some charities and migrant support groups have told us in most cases this scheme is working, but when it doesn't, it causes real stress. And more broadly, many EU citizens say the continued uncertainty over Brexit is creating huge anxiety. These three women are all EU citizens who live in Leeds. Beatrice is Spanish and is in the process of applying to stay in the UK.
I don't think it's going to be an issue for me to stay because I'm almost 5 years and I've been working all this time in the UK. But there is that little feeling that what happens if they say no?
Others want an ID card or document to prove they've been accepted, like Sarah, who's Italian.
No proof to live here, but I'm worried for that.
EU citizens like these have been told time and again their rights will be protected, but it seems that doesn't stop the worry. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
This is World News Today. A reminder of our top story. Zimbabweans and African leaders have been paying tribute to the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who has died at the age of 95. Mr. Mugabe led Zimbabwe to independence in 1980. That's it for World News Today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Hello there. The satellite picture in Europe shows an area of cloud working into the northwest of the continent. This area